The salvage ship Meridian cut through the debris field like a knife through silk. Captain Derek stood at the viewport, watching the twisted metal and broken starships drift past in the cold emptiness of space. Another conquered world. Another station left to rot after the Ethrani Empire had stripped it clean and moved on to their next conquest. Derek had been salvaging for 15 years. He'd seen a lot of terrible things in the void, but nothing prepared him for what he found in Section 7 of the abandoned research station. The containment unit was still running on emergency power, a soft blue glow illuminating the interior. Inside, huddled in the corner like a discarded rag, was a creature Derek had only read about in classified military reports. An Ethrani female. A living weapon. Except this one wasn't moving much at all. Derek's hand trembled as he opened the containment lock. The air that escaped smelled like old blood and something worse, neglect. The creature's fur, once probably a beautiful deep purple, was matted and crusted with dried blood. Her ribs stuck out like prison bars under paper-thin skin. Her golden eyes, the ones that according to reports could track moving targets at light speed, barely flickered open when Derek approached. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's lips pulled back, revealing fangs the size of a man's fingers. A low growl rumbled from her throat, but it was weak. Pathetic even. She tried to back away, but her legs couldn't support her weight. She collapsed into the corner again, trembling. Derek understood immediately what had happened. The Ethrani Empire had abandoned her here on purpose. In their culture, females were bred for combat, for aggression, for pure destructive capability. They were the most feared warriors in 3 sectors. But this one, something about her didn't fit their standards. Maybe she'd been injured. Maybe she'd failed some brutal test. Maybe she was just different. To the Ethrani, being different meant being worthless. Derek made a decision that would change everything. He pulled off his jacket and approached the creature again, moving even slower this time. "I know you're scared," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, "but you're going to die if you stay here. And I'm not going to let that happen." The creature snarled again, but Derek was already wrapping his jacket around her skeletal frame. She tried to fight him, her claws raking across his arm hard enough to draw blood, but she was too weak. In moments, Derek had her bundled up and moving toward the exit. Getting her back to the Meridian without his crew seeing her was a nightmare. Derek had 5 people working under him, and every single one of them knew that Ethrani females were problems. They were apex predators, living weapons, the kind of threat that got you killed in your sleep. But Derek looked at this creature, this broken, starving thing in his arms, and he didn't see a weapon. He saw something forgotten. Something abandoned. Something that deserved a chance. He hid her in the medical bay's isolation chamber, a sealed unit originally designed for quarantining dangerous pathogens. It seemed fitting. He named her Kessa because it was the first name that came to mind, something simple and human that felt like it belonged to a person rather than a weapon. For the first week, Kessa barely ate. Derek would leave prepared meals, protein-rich paste designed for her species based on what he could find in old military databases, and she would either ignore it or throw it at him. Her golden eyes watched him with a mix of fear and fury, tracking his every movement like he was prey. Derek didn't give up. He started coming to see her without approaching, just sitting outside the transparent panel of the isolation chamber, reading books aloud. Old human stories about survival and friendship and second chances. Kessa would ignore him or growl or turn her back. But Derek noticed she always positioned herself so she could still see him in her peripheral vision. By week 2, Kessa was eating regularly. By week 3, she'd stopped attacking when Derek entered the chamber. By week 4, something shifted. One day Derek came in to find her sitting quietly, her golden eyes fixed on his face, and she didn't flinch when he sat down next to her. "That's better," Derek whispered. "That's much better." He reached out slowly, so slowly it took 30 seconds to cover a distance of 2 feet, and gently touched her matted fur. He expected her to snap at him, to rake those terrible claws across his face. Instead, Kessa did something that Derek would never forget. She tilted her head slightly into his touch, like she was leaning into his palm. Like she was asking for more. In that moment, Derek understood that nobody, not even the Ethrani Empire, had ever shown this creature kindness before. And something inside her, buried deep under the survival instinct and the fear and the years of mistreatment, was desperate for it. Derek smiled. "Welcome home, Kessa," he said softly. "Welcome home." 3 months had passed since Derek brought Kessa aboard the Meridian, and his crew was starting to notice. He couldn't keep her hidden forever in the medical bay isolation chamber. Eventually, someone was going to ask questions. So Derek did what he always did when faced with a problem. He decided to be honest about it. He called a meeting in the common area and told them everything. His first mate, a tough woman named Riley with scars on her face and a no-nonsense attitude, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You've got to be joking," she said. "You brought an Ethrani female onto this ship?" "Derek, those things are designed to kill things. They don't think. They just destroy." "She's starving," Derek said quietly. "She was abandoned. And she's not what you think she is." The argument went on for 2 hours. In the end, it was compromise that saved the situation. Riley agreed to let Kessa stay, but only if Derek took full responsibility for her. If she became dangerous, if she hurt anyone, Derek would handle it personally. The crew accepted this, though Derek could see the fear in their eyes every time they looked at the isolation chamber. Then came the day Derek decided it was time to let Kessa out. He opened the chamber door slowly, expecting her to bolt or attack. Instead, Kessa walked out carefully, like she was testing whether the floor would hold her weight. Her fur had grown back and thick and healthy, her muscles had filled out, and those golden eyes moved with sharp intelligence as she examined everything around her. Derek had set up a small room just off the medical bay. Nothing fancy, just a space with soft padding on the floor, some climbing structures made from salvaged materials, and a large viewport that looked out into space. He'd spent weeks preparing it, wanting her to have room to move, to climb, to be something other than a prisoner. Kessa explored every inch of it like she was mapping a war zone. She climbed the structures with surprising grace for a creature that had been half-starved weeks before. She pressed her face against the viewport, watching the stars drift past. And then she turned to Derek, made a sound that was almost like a question, and tilted her head. "What do you want to learn?" Derek asked, understanding somehow that this was what she was asking. The next day Derek started teaching her. He began with simple things. How to use the ship's systems. How to read the displays on his tablet. How to understand the basic principles of navigation and engineering. Most creatures would have struggled with human technology, but Kessa picked it up like she'd been born knowing it. She would watch Derek demonstrate something once, and then she'd do it perfectly the second time. Third time? She'd already figured out 3 different ways to improve it. By week 2, Derek realized something that shocked him. Kessa wasn't just intelligent. She was smarter than most humans he'd ever met. And what made it even more remarkable was that nobody had ever bothered to teach her anything before. The Ethrani Empire had been so focused on breeding her for combat, for pure physical dominance, that they'd completely missed her potential. Derek started bringing her to the bridge. He showed her how the navigation systems worked, how to plot courses, how to read stellar maps. Kessa absorbed it all like a sponge. She would stand at the viewport, studying the space around them, and then she'd point to a location on the map and make a sound. When Derek checked her prediction against their actual position, she was always right. Always. Riley noticed it during one of her shifts. She found Derek and Kessa at the bridge together, and instead of objecting, she just watched. Kessa was studying a tactical display, her head tilted, her eyes bright with concentration. Then she reached out one clawed finger and tapped a location on the screen, made that questioning sound again and looked at Derek. "That's right," Derek said, amazed as always. "That's a maintenance station. How did you know?" Kessa made another sound and Riley found herself actually smiling. "She's learning the supply routes," Riley said, stepping forward. "She's not just memorizing what you teach her. She's thinking about it. She's putting pieces together." After that, Riley started bringing Kessa with her during maintenance shifts. The engineer in the crew, a quiet guy named Thomas, started showing her how the ship's engines worked. The communications officer, Jessica, taught her how the radio systems functioned. Within 2 months, Kessa could navigate the Meridian better than some of the crew members. But the real breakthrough came when Derek started teaching her strategy. He set up a simple chessboard in her room. He showed her how the pieces moved, what each one did. He expected it to take her weeks to understand. She understood it completely in the first game. By the 3rd game she was beating him. By the 10th game, Derek realized she wasn't just playing chess. She was thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating probabilities, understanding the importance of sacrifice and positioning. "She's not just smart," Thomas said one day, watching Kessa play chess against the ship's computer system. "She's strategic. It's like she's seeing patterns that nobody else can see." Derek nodded, understanding finally what the Ethrani Empire had thrown away. They'd wanted a perfect weapon, something that would obey commands without question. What they'd actually had, before they'd abandoned her, was a creature with the potential to become something far greater. A being who could think, analyze, plan, and create. The Ethrani Empire had made a terrible mistake. They'd culled their own species' potential simply because they didn't recognize intelligence when it didn't come wrapped in raw aggression. Kessa, sitting at the chessboard with her head tilted in concentration, was proof of what they'd lost. It started with a single message. Derek was docking at the Centauri trading station for supplies when he received a transmission marked priority. It was from Professor Harrison at the Institute of Xenological Studies, one of the most prestigious research facilities in human space. The message was simple and direct. They wanted to talk about Kessa. Derek's heart sank. He tried to keep her existence quiet, but the universe was smaller than people thought. Someone on his crew must have mentioned her during a docking. Someone had talked. He almost deleted the message without responding. But something made him reconsider. The professor's words were respectful, curious rather than demanding. Maybe, Derek thought, this could be an opportunity instead of a threat. 3 weeks later, Derek stood in a presentation hall at the institute, watching Professor Harrison and a room full of scientists stare at Kessa like she was a miracle. And maybe she was. Derek had brought her down to the planet in an environmental suit, making sure she was comfortable and safe. When they entered the presentation hall, the entire room went silent. Kessa was magnificent now. Her purple fur gleamed under the bright lights, her movements were graceful and controlled, and those golden eyes tracked everything with intelligent awareness. "This is Kessa," Derek said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "An Ethrani female. But she's not what the Ethrani Empire thinks she is." He spent the next 3 hours explaining everything. How he'd found her abandoned and starving. How he'd taught her human technology, strategy, and problem-solving. How she'd absorbed information like nothing he'd ever seen before. And most importantly, how she'd proven that everything the Ethrani Empire believed about their own species was fundamentally wrong. Professor Harrison stepped forward with a tablet, showing Kessa a series of complex mathematical problems. Without any prompting from Derek, Kessa reached out and began solving them. She worked through calculus, physics equations, even theoretical mathematics that Derek didn't fully understand. Every answer was correct. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. One scientist actually stood up and started recording everything on his personal device. Others were already making calls on their communication units. Within hours, the news was spreading across the entire human sphere. Ethrani female shows signs of advanced cognition, the headlines read. Breakthrough discovery challenges everything we know about apex predators. It should have been good news. It wasn't. Within 48 hours, Derek's communication array was flooded with messages. Academic institutions wanted access to study Kessa. Military commanders wanted to recruit her for their forces. Corporate entities wanted to purchase her genetic material. And then the Ethrani Empire sent their message. It was delivered by a diplomatic vessel that pulled into orbit around Centauri Station. The communication was encoded in multiple languages, but the meaning was crystal clear. The Ethrani Empire demanded the immediate return of their property, identified as a defective breeding specimen. If Derek refused, there would be consequences. Derek stood in the Institute's communication center, Riley beside him, and watched the message play out on the screen. The speaker was an Ethrani commander, his massive frame filling the view screen, his voice deep and commanding. "That creature was discarded for a reason," the commander said, his golden eyes blazing with anger. "She is defective. Broken. And she represents a threat to the stability of our society. Return her or face the military might of the Ethrani Empire." Riley let out a low whistle. Well, that's not good. But the most unexpected thing happened next. Professor Harrison stood up and walked directly to the communication console. Without asking Derek for permission, he responded to the message himself. "This is Professor Marcus Harrison of the Institute of Xenological Studies," the professor said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm speaking on behalf of the Galactic Council of Science and every academic institution in human space. What you're calling a defective specimen is actually the most intelligent being we've ever encountered. Your species doesn't have a defective female. You have a revolutionary." The Ethrani commander's expression didn't change, but Derek could see something shift in the commander's eyes. "She has solved mathematical problems that our greatest minds have been working on for decades," Harrison continued. "She understands strategic concepts that military tacticians spend their entire careers trying to master. And most importantly, she represents proof that your entire breeding program has been fundamentally flawed. She's not defective. Your system is." The message ended abruptly. For a long moment, there was silence in the communication center. Then news of Harrison's response spread even faster than news of Kessa herself. Within days, military powers were lining up to negotiate with Derek. The United Earth Alliance wanted to form an alliance with Kessa. The Vorath Collective offered Derek massive amounts of credits just for access to her strategic insights. Every major power in known space suddenly wanted something from him. But the strangest thing was what happened to public opinion. Regular people, humans living ordinary lives on ordinary stations and planets, started seeing Kessa not as a weapon or a research subject, but as a symbol of something bigger. She became proof that potential exists everywhere, even in places the powerful have discarded. She became proof that intelligence and strength didn't have to come from violence and control. There were protests against the Ethrani Empire. People wearing symbols supporting Kessa's freedom. Online petitions demanding that the Ethrani government change their brutal breeding practices. Kessa had become more than just an individual. She'd become an idea. Derek stood in his quarters on the Meridian, watching Kessa sleep peacefully in her room, and he realized something important. The universe was about to change. Not because of military force or diplomatic maneuvering, but because one small act of kindness had revealed a truth that nobody could ignore. Kessa wasn't a weapon. She was a revolution waiting to happen. The decision was Kessa's alone to make. Derek had told her that she could stay with him on the Meridian for as long as she wanted. He'd told her that the galaxy was dangerous, that returning to Ethrani space was incredibly risky, that the Empire would see her as a threat to everything they'd built. But he could see something in her golden eyes that he'd come to recognize over the past year, determination mixed with purpose. "I have to go," Kessa had said one evening, using the speech synthesizer that the Institute had helped her develop. Her voice was artificial but clear, and every word carried weight. "They threw me away because they didn't understand what I could be. But there are others like me. Thousands of others. They're still out there, still being treated like broken things." Derek had wanted to argue. Instead, he'd helped her prepare. The plan was dangerous but simple. Kessa would return to Ethrani space, not in chains or under guard but as a free being. Professor Harrison had arranged for a diplomatic vessel to escort her. The United Earth Alliance had provided safe passage through their territories. And most importantly, they'd arranged for something that the Ethrani Empire had never anticipated: communication networks that the discarded females could access. For years, the Ethrani Empire had hidden the truth about what happened to the females they deemed defective. The ones who didn't show enough aggression, or who recovered too slowly from injuries, or who simply didn't fit the rigid standards the Empire had set. They were sent to labor camps, abandoned on remote stations, or simply executed. Nobody talked about it. Nobody was supposed to know. Kessa changed that. 3 days after she arrived in Ethrani space, hidden messages started spreading through the underground networks. Communications that bypassed the Empire's official channels. They were simple messages at first. Images of Kessa. Videos of her solving problems, speaking with clarity and intelligence, demonstrating concepts that contradicted everything the Empire had taught about females being simple-minded weapons. And then came the real message. "My name is Kessa," it read. "I was abandoned by the Ethrani Empire because I didn't fit their standards. But I am not broken. I am intelligent. I am capable of thought and strategy and choice. And I am not alone. If you have been cast aside, if you have been told you are defective, if you have suffered under a system that sees you as nothing but a tool, I am here to tell you the truth. You are not broken. The system is broken." Within hours, thousands of messages came back. Thousands of responses from discarded females across Ethrani space, all saying the same thing: "We are here. We are listening. What do we do?" Kessa's response was revolutionary. She didn't tell them to fight. She didn't tell them to rebel through violence. Instead, she told them to do something much more powerful: to stop obeying, to refuse orders, to use their intelligence instead of their instincts, to ask questions instead of accepting commands. The Ethrani Empire's entire system depended on obedience. The females were bred and trained to follow orders without question, to attack when commanded, to accept their role as weapons without complaint. But Kessa was teaching them something different. She was teaching them to think. Derek watched from a monitoring station as the uprising began, and it wasn't what anyone had expected. There were no battles at first. No violent clashes or military confrontations. Instead, there was something far more destabilizing: a quiet refusal to participate. Discarded females throughout Ethrani space simply stopped doing what they were told. They walked away from labor camps. They refused to fight in the Empire's wars. They gathered in groups and discussed the messages Kessa was sending them. The Ethrani military commanders were confused. They were trained for combat, for conquest, for domination through force. They had no framework for dealing with passive resistance. They ordered executions and the females didn't fight back. They ordered forced compliance, and the females simply found ways to hide instead. Within weeks, thousands of discarded females had gathered at a secret location on one of the outer Ethrani colonies. And Kessa was there with them. Derek saw the video transmission that came through the human networks. Kessa stood in front of thousands of her own kind, her purple fur gleaming under harsh artificial lights, those intelligent golden eyes looking out at faces that ranged from hopeful to terrified to angry. She spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every female understood her words. "We have been told that we are not good enough," Kessa said. "That we lack the aggression, the speed, the instinctive drive to be true Ethrani females. They threw us away like we were garbage. But I am standing here as proof that everything they told us is a lie. I am intelligent. I am capable. I am strong, not just physically but mentally. And so are each of you." She pointed to different females in the crowd. You were abandoned because you preferred solving problems to fighting. Congratulations. You're now the chief engineer for our new settlement. You were discarded for showing compassion. You're our medical officer. You questioned orders. You're our strategist. What Kessa was doing was revolutionary because she was doing something the Ethrani Empire had never done. She was valuing the females for their minds, not just their bodies. She was creating a system where intelligence mattered, where different skills were celebrated, where questioning authority was actually encouraged. The Empire tried to stop her. They sent military forces to the outer colony. But something unexpected happened. Some of the official military females, the ones the Empire had considered successful products of their breeding program, began receiving the same messages Kessa was sending. And some of them started to wonder, what if they'd been lied to as well? By the time the Empire realized what was happening, it was too late. Half their military was refusing to fight against their own sisters. The females who had always been considered defective were now organizing entire communities, creating infrastructure, establishing systems of government based on thought and discussion rather than obedience and control. The Ethrani Empire, built on the foundation of absolute control and military dominance, was crumbling from the inside. Derek watched it all unfold on screens in the human observation station, and he realized that Kessa had accomplished something remarkable. She hadn't conquered the Ethrani Empire through force. She had overthrown it by teaching her people to think. And nothing, Derek understood, was more powerful than that. 20 years had changed Derek in ways he never expected. His hair was completely gray now, and his face carried the kind of lines that came from smiling more than worrying. He sat in the observation deck of the new Ethrani Parliament building, watching the city sprawl out below him in organized, beautiful patterns. Gardens grew where weapons factories once stood. Schools occupied the spaces where training camps for combat had dominated. The entire civilization had been rebuilt from the ground up, piece by piece, choice by choice. And at the center of it all was Kessa. She stood on the Parliament platform, addressing a gathering of representatives from every corner of Ethrani space. Her voice, now enhanced with natural projection rather than the synthesizer she'd used years ago, carried across the massive chamber. Her purple fur had deepened to a rich wine color, and she moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for. "Education is not a luxury," Kessa was saying, her golden eyes bright with passion. "It is the foundation of everything we're building. For centuries we were told that thinking was weakness, that questioning was betrayal, that our value came only from our ability to destroy. But look at us now. Look at what we've created when we stopped believing those lies." The crowd erupted in applause. Derek found himself smiling despite the tears that had started forming in his eyes. After the session ended, Kessa made her way through the crowds to find Derek. She moved with purpose, acknowledging greetings from her people but never losing sight of where she was going. When she reached him, she did something she still did after all these years. She tilted her head slightly, the gesture that had once meant she was asking a question. "You came," she said. "It wasn't really a question." "I wouldn't miss it," Derek replied. "How was the vote on the new education initiative?" "Unanimous," Kessa said, settling into the seat beside him. "All 47 districts voted in favor. By next year, every young Ethrani, regardless of gender, will have access to comprehensive education in science, mathematics, art, philosophy, and critical thinking. No more filtering. No more hiding knowledge." Derek reached over and placed his hand on her arm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of their entire history. "I'm proud of you," he said. "So proud." Kessa made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. I wouldn't be here without you, she said. Do you remember what I was when you found me? Starving. Broken. Convinced that I was worthless because that's what I'd been taught. You were never worthless, Derek said firmly. You were just waiting for someone to give you a chance. Over the following week, Derek attended several ceremonies and events. He watched Kessa dedicate a new medical facility named after the Ethrani females who had died during the transition to democracy. He listened to her speak at a university where students of all species came to learn from her. He sat with her during a quiet evening as she reviewed reports from the outer colonies, still working toward bringing all Ethrani into the new system. What struck Derek most was how different Ethrani society had become. Young females walked freely through the streets, pursuing careers in science, art, engineering, and philosophy. Males, who had previously been largely absent from society, kept separate in military academies, now participated in community governance and education. Families actually existed in a way they never had before because the Empire's breeding programs had been completely dismantled. On his final evening before returning to human space, Derek and Kessa walked through one of the new public gardens. The plants were a mixture of Ethrani native species and imports from other worlds, a deliberate symbol of the new, open Ethrani society. I've been thinking about the past, Kessa said as they walked. About that moment when you found me in the wreckage. Do you know what saved me? Your will to survive? Derek asked. No, Kessa said, stopping to look at him directly. Your willingness to see potential instead of just seeing a dangerous animal. The Ethrani Empire looked at me and saw a defective weapon. You looked at me and saw a person. That one difference changed everything. Derek didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there watching his old friend look out at the civilization she had built. I want you to know something, Kessa continued. Everything I've done here, the government structure, the education system, the way we've rebuilt our entire society, it all comes from the lessons you taught me. You taught me that thinking matters. That different perspectives are valuable. That strength doesn't come from control but from trust. That was revolutionary for my people. Over the next few years, Derek made regular trips back to Ethrani space. He watched as the transformation deepened. Young Ethrani developed new technologies based on collaboration rather than domination. Artists emerged, creating works that reflected the complexity and beauty of their species. Scientists made breakthroughs that benefited the entire galaxy. Philosophers and writers contributed to the broader conversations that all sentient species were having about ethics, consciousness, and what it meant to build a just society. And through it all, Kessa remained at the center, not as a dictator or supreme leader, but as a symbol and voice of what was possible when a species chose enlightenment over control. Derek grew older. His hair turned completely white. His movements became slower. But every time he visited Ethrani space, Kessa would be there to greet him. And they would sit together in the gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, and remember. On Derek's final visit, he was 82 years old now and his health was failing. Kessa took him to a new monument that had been erected in the Parliament Square. It was a statue of two figures, one human, one Ethrani, standing together. The plaque beneath it read, "To Derek and Kessa, who showed us that partnership built on trust and belief in potential can change worlds." Derek wept when he saw it. "You didn't need to do this," he said. "Yes, I did," Kessa replied. "Because the story isn't just mine. It never was. It's ours. And I wanted future generations to understand that the greatest strength isn't conquering others. It's believing in them." When Derek returned to human space for the last time, he carried with him the knowledge that his life had mattered in ways he never could have imagined. He had found a creature that the powerful had thrown away, and by simply treating her with kindness and respect, he had changed the trajectory of an entire civilization. Kessa never forgot where she came from or who had given her the chance to become who she was meant to be. And in the end, that partnership, built on trust, belief, and the radical idea that everyone deserves a chance, became the foundation for a new age of Ethrani history. Not an age of conquest and control, but an age of thought, choice, and possibility.